Archaeologists found a loaf of bread inside a Roman tomb. It was 2,000 years old, perfectly preserved, still shaped into 8 neat segments, and it was placed there on purpose. Not left behind, not forgotten, deliberately placed. Here's the part that will mess with your head. That bread wasn't for the dead. It was for the living. It was protection money. And if it wasn't paid, if that bread didn't make it into the grave, the Romans believed something unthinkable would start happening to your family. What they feared isn't that different from what we fear today. Stick with me, because by the end of this, you'll never look at a loaf of bread the same way again. Pliny the Elder, the man who documented the eruption of Vesuvius from a boat while everyone else was running, once wrote about the rituals of Roman daily life. Not politics, not war. The deep ancestral fear buried inside ordinary people. Because Romans didn't think of the dead as spirits who floated away to some cloud. They thought of them as roommates, difficult, demanding, invisible roommates who had moved into a much smaller, much darker apartment underground. And if you didn't keep those roommates fed, things were about to get very ugly for everyone still breathing. The evidence is everywhere if you look at Pompeii today. The Panis Quadratus, the famous circular bread with a cross scored into the top, shows up not just inside bakery ovens, but inside parentalia graves. But why that specific shape? Why that specific size? The answer is buried inside the engineering of the bread itself, and it reveals an entire hidden industry that most historians never talk about. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, you need to see what a Roman funeral actually looked like, because it looked nothing like what you're imagining. Picture the Silicernium. It's a funeral feast, but nothing like the quiet, somber gatherings we hold today. This is loud. It's greasy. It's happening in the middle of a necropolis, surrounded by stone tombs on every side. The family is literally seated on stone benches inside a cemetery, with the smell of roasting pork and honey-heavy cakes thick in the air. They aren't eating to remember the dead. They are eating with them. A piece of thick, coarse bread gets dipped in wine and placed near the burial urn. They actually wait for the ghost to eat, and the energy in that crowd is frantic, not peaceful, not serene, frantic. Because if the bread stays untouched and the ritual gets skipped, the Roman mind goes straight to the worst-case scenario. Failed harvests, sick children, a house that feels cold even in the summer heat of Rome. Here's something no one talks about. Roman cemeteries had plumbing, not for water, not for drainage, for feeding the dead. In sites like Isola Sacra near Rome, archaeologists uncovered a system of lead and terracotta pipes sticking out of the ground, running directly into graves. These are called libation tubes. They weren't ventilation shafts. They weren't escape routes for the soul. They were designed so a family member could stand above the earth and pour wine, liquefied honey, and breadcrumbs directly down to the bones of the person they lost. Think about that sound. The liquid splashing against the skeleton of your mother, your father, your child. This wasn't metaphorical. It wasn't symbolic. It was a mechanical attempt to physically bridge the gap between the living world and whatever came next. They were trying to get the food as close to the dead as physically possible. Now let's talk about the bread itself. Because when you look closely at the engineering of the Panis Quadratus, you realize this wasn't just a loaf. It was a highly specialized piece of Roman technology, designed for a purpose most bakers today couldn't imagine. And it leads directly to one of the most disturbing questions in Roman archaeology. What happened when the bread didn't work? Stay with me. The Panis Quadratus had a horizontal groove carved around its waist. That groove wasn't decorative. It allowed the loaf to be tied with a string and carried easily to the cemetery, hands-free, like a dark errand on the way to a burial. The 8 segments weren't aesthetic choices. They were meant to be broken off and shared between the living and the dead at the feast. When a Roman baker like Terentius Neo, whose name was stamped into the bottom of loaves found at Pompeii, pressed his seal into that bread, he knew. Some loaves would feed a living family. Some would end up in a stone box, sealed in darkness, waiting for something that no longer had a mouth. But what happened when the funeral bread failed? When the ghost still wasn't satisfied? The Romans had a backup plan, and it involved midnight rituals, black beans, and a walk through a dark house that you were not allowed to look back from. During the festival of Lemuria in May, the head of the household would wake at midnight, barefoot, alone. He would walk through every room of the house, throwing black beans over his shoulder without turning around, because looking back meant inviting the ghosts to follow him. With each throw, he repeated, "With these I redeem me and mine." He believed the lemures, the restless, angry dead, were right behind him, collecting the beans from the floor like a trail of breadcrumbs. This is the same psychological core as the funeral bread. The dead are always among us. They are always starving. Feed them or suffer the consequences. If you're still with me, and you should be, because this is about to get genuinely disturbing, make sure you're subscribed, because what comes next completely changes how you understand why humans have been leaving food for the dead since the beginning of recorded history. Even Roman literature couldn't escape the obsession. In Petronius's Satyricon, written around 60 AD, just 20 years before Vesuvius buried Pompeii, there is a famous dinner scene called Trimalchio's feast. Trimalchio is a wealthy Roman freedman, a former slave who clawed his way to obscene riches, and he spends the entire dinner talking about his tomb. He describes a monument carved with fruits and bread, a permanent display of abundance set in stone. He wants his death to be a banquet that never ends. This reveals something ugly and very human. Leaving high-quality bread in a tomb wasn't just about the afterlife. It was a status symbol for the living. It said, "We are so wealthy that we can afford to waste perfectly good food on someone who cannot chew." Death as a performance. Grief as a flex. Think about what grain actually meant to Rome. This wasn't just food. This was power. The Mola Salsa was a sacred mixture of toasted grain and salt prepared exclusively by the Vestal virgins, Rome's most powerful female religious figures. It was used in animal sacrifices to consecrate the offering to the gods. Regular Romans understood this deeply. Grain wasn't just nutrition. It was the heartbeat of the civilization. When a Roman family placed bread in a tomb, they were placing the most sacred thing they owned next to the person they had lost. They were making a statement. Even in death, you are still Roman. You still belong to the system. You still have citizenship. In Rome, if you don't have bread, you don't have a life. The bread in the tomb was proof that the dead still had one. The loaves you see in museums today look like charcoal, black, brittle, either burned in the Vesuvius eruption or slowly oxidized across 20 centuries. But when they were placed in those tombs, they were fresh. They smelled like yeast and wood smoke. There is something devastating in that contrast. The warmth of a just-baked loaf pressed against cold stone. And here's a detail that most people don't know. Some Roman tombs were modified over time specifically to allow for regular feeding. Families returned on the dies parentalis, the anniversary of the death, to remove the old stale bread and replace it with a fresh loaf. It was a recurring chore, like weeding a garden, like watering a plant. The relationship with the dead was not a one-time farewell. It was a subscription service you could not cancel without risking a haunting. Stick with me, because the next part is where this entire ritual stops being about superstition and starts being about something deeply, uncomfortably modern. During the Rosalia, another festival of the Roman dead, families would arrive at the tombs with armfuls of roses and violets, draping the stone in color. But the flowers were secondary. The food always came first. And somewhere in that procession, there was a mother walking to the tomb of her child, carrying a small piece of honey-sweetened bread. She wasn't performing a ritual. She wasn't following a religious checklist. She was feeding her child in the only way she still could. If you can still provide a meal, then the person isn't truly gone. They're just elsewhere. This is the quiet, human moment buried inside all the superstition and terror. A mother trying to feed a child who can no longer swallow, hoping that somehow the essence of the grain still reaches them. After 9 days of formal mourning, the Romans held the Cena Novendialis, the 9th day dinner. This was the official end of the primary mourning period. Bread was shaped into new forms, special configurations meant to appease the spirit for its final transition. They believed the soul crossed over on that 9th day, but they kept leaving food even after, just in case. Roman religion was orthopraxic, meaning it was about doing the correct actions, not necessarily believing the correct things. You didn't have to believe the ghost ate the bread. You just had to put the bread there. The action itself was the shield. Follow the steps and you're safe. Skip the steps and you're exposed. It's a mechanical approach to grief that's more rational than it first appears. In some cases, the bread was placed directly on the funeral pyre. As the body burned, the loaf toasted alongside the flesh, then charred into the same black ash. The smell would have been extraordinary, a sickening blend of a bakery and a cremation, yeast and wood smoke, and something darker underneath. This bread wasn't for the ghost to eat later. It was a travel snack for the journey. The Romans believed the soul had a long walk ahead, across the Styx, through the darkness, all the way to whatever waited on the other side. Charon, the ferryman, was famously bribed with a coin placed under the tongue of the dead. But the Romans figured a fresh loaf of bread might buy you a better seat on the boat. Practical, transactional, Roman. Ultimately, every loaf of bread in every Roman tomb was about control. Rome built its empire on control, of nature, of armies, of the gods themselves. Death was the one force that could not be conquered with a legion, so they conquered it the only way left. They turned it into a dinner party. They converted a cosmic catastrophe into a domestic chore. If death is just a hungry neighbor, you can manage it. You just need to keep the oven running. You just need enough grain. As long as the bread is in the tomb, the world makes sense. We like to think we are different from these people. We look at a lead pipe going into a skull and feel superior. We call it primitive. We call it superstition. But we still leave flowers at grave sites that wither and die within the week. We still leave coins, trinkets, little offerings. We still stand at a grave and feel the unbearable urge to do something for a person who no longer needs anything. The Romans were just more literal about it. They understood a fundamental psychological truth that we've never actually moved past. We cannot stand the idea of our loved ones being empty. We fill the void with what we know, and what we know is food. Next time you see a loaf of bread, fresh from the bakery, still warm, still smelling like the first good thing, think about those dark, silent Roman tombs. Think about the thousands of loaves that sat in the darkness for centuries, waiting for a mouth that was nothing but bone. Archaeologists pull these objects out of the earth and put them in glass cases, lighting them carefully, noting the craftsmanship. But the person who placed that bread in the tomb wasn't thinking about history. They were shaking, with grief, with fear, with the desperate hope that this small, round piece of wheat would be enough to keep the darkness quiet for one more year. The bread isn't just an artifact, it's a ghost story you can hold in your hands. It's the proof that even the greatest empire in human history, the civilization that built the roads, the aqueducts, the Colosseum, was ultimately just a group of people who were terrified of the dark and did the only thing they could think of to push it back. They baked something warm and hoped it was enough.